The history of Australia is the history of the land and peoples of the continent of Australia. People first arrived on the Australian mainland by sea from maritime Southeast Asia between 50,000 and 65,000 years ago and penetrated to all parts of the continent, from the rainforests in the north, the deserts of the center, and the subantarctic islands of Tasmania and Bass Strait. The artistic, musical, and spiritual traditions they established are among the longest surviving such traditions in human history. The first Torres Strait Islanders, ethnically and culturally distinct from the Aboriginal people, arrived from what is now Papua New Guinea around 2,500 years ago, and settled in the islands of the Torres Strait and the Cape York Peninsula, forming the northern tip of the Australian landmass. The first known landing in Australia by Europeans was in 1606 by Dutch navigator Willem Janszoon on Australia's northern coast. Later that year, Spanish explorer Luis Vaz de Torres sailed through and navigated what is now called Torres Strait and associated islands. 29 other Dutch navigators explored the western and southern coasts in the 17th century and named the continent New Holland. Macassan trepangers visited Australia's northern coasts after 1720, possibly earlier. Other European explorers followed until, in 1770, Lieutenant James Cook charted the east coast of Australia and claimed it for Great Britain. He returned to London with accounts favoring colonization at Botany Bay, now in Sydney. The first fleet of British ships arrived at Botany Bay in January 1788 to establish a penal colony, the first colony on the Australian mainland. In the century that followed, the British established other colonies on the continent, and European explorers ventured into its interior. Aboriginal people were greatly weakened and their numbers diminished by introduced diseases and conflict with the colonists during this period. Gold rushes and agricultural industries brought prosperity. Transportation of British convicts to Australia was phased out from 1840 to 1868. Autonomous parliamentary democracies began to be established throughout the 6 British colonies from the mid-19th century. The colonies voted by referendum to unite in a federation in 1901, and modern Australia came into being. Australia fought as part of British Empire and later Commonwealth in the 2 World Wars and was to become a long-standing ally of the United States when threatened by Imperial Japan during World War II. Trade with Asia increased and a post-war immigration program received more than 6.5 million migrants from every continent. Supported by immigration of people from almost every country in the world since the end of World War II, the population increased to more than 25.5 million by 2020, with 30% of the population born overseas. Indigenous prehistory. Humans are believed to have arrived in Australia 50,000 to 65,000 years ago. As hunter-gatherers, they established enduring spiritual and artistic traditions and used a range of implements adapted to their environments. Recent estimates of the population at the time of British settlement range from 500,000 to 1 million. There is considerable archaeological discussion as to the route taken by the first population. People appear to have arrived by sea during a period of glaciation when New Guinea and Tasmania were joined to the continent. However, the journey still required sea travel, making them among the world's earliest mariners. Scott Kane wrote in 2013 that the first wave may have been prompted by the eruption of Lake Toba. If they arrived about 70,000 years ago, they could have crossed the water from Timor when the sea level was low, but if they came later, around 50,000 years ago, a more likely route would have been through the Moluccas to New Guinea. Given that the likely landfall regions have been under approximately 50 meters of water for the past 15,000 years, it is unlikely that the timing will ever be established with certainty. The oldest known sites of human occupation in Australia are in Arnhem Land in the north of the continent and have been dated to between 50,000 and 65,000 BP. The population spread into a range of very different environments. Devil's Lair in the extreme southwest of the continent was occupied around 47,000 BP and Tasmania by 39,000 BP. The earliest known human remains in Australia, found at Lake Mungo, a dry lake in the southwest of New South Wales, are about 40,000 years old. Remains found at Mungo suggest one of the world's oldest known cremations, thus indicating early evidence for religious ritual among humans. The spread of the population also altered the environment. There is evidence of the deliberate use of fire to shape the Australian environment 46,000 years ago. In many parts of Australia, fire stick farming was used to clear vegetation to make travel easier, drive animals into ambushes, and create open grasslands rich in animal and vegetable food sources. More than 60 species of animals, including Australian megafauna, became extinct by 10,000 BP. Researchers have variously attributed these extinctions to human hunting and firing practices, climate change, or a combination of these factors. The inhabitants developed other technologies to better exploit diverse environments. Fiber and nets for use in watercraft and fishing developed before 40,000 BP. More complex tools, such as edge-ground axes hafted to wooden handles, appeared by 35,000 BP. Elaborate trade networks also developed. Ochre was transported 250 kilometers from the Barrier Range to Lake Mungo 40,000 years ago. Shells for decorative beads were transported 500 kilometers by 30,000 BP. More extensive trade networks developed in later times. The earliest Aboriginal rock art consists of handprints, hand stencils, and engravings of circles, tracks, lines, and cupules, and has been dated to 35,000 years ago. Around 20,000 years ago, Aboriginal artists were depicting humans and animals. However, the dating is contentious, and some researchers believe that known examples of Aboriginal rock art are possibly more recent. The Aboriginal population was confronted with significant changes to climate and environment. About 30,000 years ago, sea levels began to fall, temperatures in the southeast of the continent dropped by as much as 9 degrees Celsius, and the interior of Australia became more arid. About 20,000 years ago, New Guinea and Tasmania were connected to the Australian continent, which was more than a quarter larger than today. About 19,000 years ago, temperatures and sea levels began to rise. Tasmania became separated from the mainland some 14,000 years ago, and between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago, thousands of islands in the Torres Strait and around the coast of Australia were formed. Josephine Flood writes that the flooding and loss of land as coastlines receded might have led to greater emphasis on territorial boundaries separating groups, stronger clan identity, and the development of the rainbow serpent and other mythologies. The warmer climate was associated with new technologies. Small backbladed stone tools appeared 15 to 19,000 years ago. Wooden javelins and boomerangs have been found dating from 10,000 years ago. Stone points for spears have been found dating from 5 to 7,000 years ago. Spear throwers were probably developed more recently than 6,500 years ago. Sea levels stabilized at around their current level about 6,500 years ago. Warmer wetter conditions, and the new coastlines led to significant changes in Aboriginal social and economic organization. New coastal societies emerged around tidal reefs, estuaries, and flooded river valleys, and coastal islands were incorporated into local economies. There was a proliferation of stone tool, plant processing, and landscape modification technologies. Elaborate fish and eel traps involving channels up to 3 kilometers long were in use in Western Victoria from about 6,500 years ago. Semi-permanent collections of wooden huts on mounds also appeared in Western Victoria, associated with a more systematic exploitation of new food sources in the wetlands. Aboriginal Tasmanians were isolated from the mainland from about 14,000 years ago. As a result, they only possessed 1/4 of the tools and equipment of the adjacent mainland and were without hafted axes, grinding technology, stone-tipped weapons, spear throwers, and the boomerang. By 3,700 BP, they had ceased to eat fish and used bone tools. Coastal Tasmanians switched from fish to abalone and crayfish, and more Tasmanians moved to the interior. The Tasmanians built watercraft from reeds and bark and journeyed up to 10 kilometers offshore to visit islands and hunt for seals and muttonbirds. Around 4,000 years ago, the first phase of occupation of the Torres Strait Islands began. By 2,500 years ago, more of the islands were occupied and a distinctive Torres Strait Island maritime culture emerged. Agriculture also developed on some islands, and by 700 years ago, villages appeared. One genetic study in 2012 has suggested that about 4,000 years ago, some Indian explorers settled in Australia and assimilated into the local population. However, more recent studies do not support this view. Nevertheless, some innovations were imported to the mainland from neighboring cultures. The dingo was introduced about 4,000 years ago. Shellfish hooks appeared in Australia about 1,200 years ago and were probably introduced from the Torres Strait or by Polynesian seafarers. From the mid-1660s, fishing vessels from Indonesia regularly visited the north coast of Australia in search of trepang, sea cucumber. Trade and social relationships developed which were reflected in Aboriginal art, ceremonies, and oral traditions. Aboriginal people adopted dugout canoes and metal harpoon heads from the Indonesians, which allowed them to better hunt dugong and turtle off the coast and nearby islands. Despite these interactions with neighboring cultures, the basic structure of Aboriginal society was unchanged. Family groups were joined in bands and clans averaging about 25 people, each with a defined territory for foraging. Clans were attached to tribes or nations associated with particular languages and country. At the time of European contact, there were about 600 tribes or nations and 250 distinct languages with various dialects. Aboriginal society was egalitarian with no formal government or chiefs. Authority rested with elders who held extensive ritual knowledge gained over many years. Group decisions were generally made through the consensus of elders. The traditional economy was cooperative, with males generally hunting large game while females gathered local staples such as small animals, shellfish, vegetables, fruits, seeds, and nuts. Food was shared within groups and exchanged across groups. Aboriginal groups were semi-nomadic, generally ranging over a specific territory defined by natural features. Members of a group would enter the territory of another group through rites established by marriage and kinship or by invitation for specific purposes such as ceremonies and sharing abundant seasonal foods. As all natural features of the land were created by ancestral beings, a group's particular country provided physical and spiritual nourishment. According to Australian Aboriginal mythology and the animist framework developed in Aboriginal Australia, the dreaming is a sacred era in which ancestral totemic spirit beings formed the creation. The dreaming established the laws and structures of society and the ceremonies performed to ensure continuity of life and land. The extent to which some Aboriginal societies were agricultural is controversial. In the Lake Condah region of Western Victoria, the inhabitants built elaborate eel and fish traps, and hundreds gathered in semi-permanent stone and bark huts during the eel season. However, these groups still moved across their territory several times a year to exploit other seasonal food sources. In semi-arid areas, millet was harvested, stacked, and threshed, and the seeds stored for later use. In tropical areas, the tops of yams were replanted. Flood argues that such practices are better classified as resource management than agriculture, and that Aboriginal societies did not develop the systematic cultivation of crops or permanent villages such as existed in the Torres Strait Islands. Elizabeth Williams has called the inhabitants of the more settled regions of the Murray Valley complex hunter-gatherers. Early European exploration. Dutch discovery and exploration. Although a theory of Portuguese discovery in the 1520s exists, it lacks definitive evidence. The Dutch East India Company ship, Duifken, captained by Willem Janszoon, made the first documented European landing in Australia in 1606. That same year, a Spanish expedition sailing in nearby waters and led by Portuguese navigator Pedro Fernandes de Queiroz had landed in the New Hebrides and, believing them to be the fabled southern continent, named the land Australia del Espiritu Santo, southern land of the Holy Spirit, in honor of his Queen Margaret of Austria, the wife of Philip III of Spain. Later that year, Queiroz's deputy Luis Vaz de Torres sailed to the north of Australia through Torres Strait, along New Guinea's southern coast. The Dutch contributed a great deal to Europe's knowledge of Australia's coast. In 1616, Dirk Hartog, sailing off course en route from the Cape of Good Hope to Batavia, landed on an island off Shark Bay, Western Australia. In 1622-23, the ship Lewin made the first recorded rounding of the southwest corner of the continent, where Cape Lewin was later named after her. The name of the ship's captain is lost. In 1627, the south coast of Australia was accidentally discovered by Francois Thigen and named T. Land van Pieternuts, in honor of the highest-ranking passenger, Pieternuts, Extraordinary Councillor of India. In 1628, a squadron of Dutch ships was sent by the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies Peter de Carpentier to explore the northern coast. These ships made extensive examinations, particularly in the Gulf of Carpentaria, named in honor of de Carpentier. Abel Tasman's voyage of 1642 was the first known European expedition to reach Van Diemen's Land, later Tasmania, and New Zealand, and to sight Fiji. On his second voyage of 1644, he also contributed significantly to the mapping of the Australian mainland, which he called New Holland, making observations on the land and people of the north coast below New Guinea. Following Tasman's voyages, the Dutch were able to make almost complete maps of Australia's northern and western coasts and much of its southern and southeastern Tasmanian coasts, as reflected in the 1648 map by Joan Blau. Nova et accuratissima terrarum orbis tabula. British and French exploration. William Dampier, an English buccaneer and explorer, landed on the northwest coast of New Holland in 1688 and again in 1699 and published influential descriptions of the Aboriginal people. In 1769, Lieutenant James Cook, in command of HMS Endeavour, traveled to Tahiti to observe and record the transit of Venus. Cook also carried secret Admiralty instructions to locate the supposed southern continent. This continent was not found, a disappointment to Alexander Dalrymple and his fellow members of the Royal Society who had urged the Admiralty to undertake this mission. Cook decided to survey the east coast of New Holland, the only major part of that continent that had not been charted by Dutch navigators. On April 19, 1770, the Endeavour reached the east coast of New Holland and 10 days later anchored at Botany Bay. Cook charted the coast to its northern extent and formally took possession of the east coast of New Holland on August 21st and 22nd UST 1770 when on Possession Island off the west coast of Cape York Peninsula. He noted in his journal that he could land no more upon this eastern coast of New Holland. And on the western side I can make no new discovery, the honor of which belongs to the Dutch navigators, and as such they may lay claim to it as their property. Italicized words crossed out in the original, but the eastern coast from the latitude of 38 south down to this place I am confident was never seen or visited by any European before us, and therefore by the same rule belongs to Great Britain. Italicized words crossed out in the original. In March 1772, Marc-Joseph Marion du Fresne, in command of 2 French ships, reached Van Diemen's Land on his way to Tahiti and the South Seas. His party became the first recorded Europeans to encounter the indigenous Tasmanians and to kill one of them. In the same year, a French expedition led by Louis Alino de Saint-Éluarn became the first Europeans to formally claim sovereignty over the west coast of Australia, but no attempt was made to follow this with colonization. Colonization. Plans for colonization before 1788. Although various proposals for the colonization of Australia were made prior to 1788, none were attempted. In 1717, Jean-Pierre Pouy sent a plan to the Dutch East India Company for the colonization of an area in modern South Australia. The company rejected the plan with the comment that there is no prospect of use or benefit to the company in it, but rather very certain and heavy costs. In contrast, Emmanuel Bowen, in 1747, promoted the benefits of exploring and colonizing the country, writing, "It is impossible to conceive a country that promises fairer from its situation than this of Terra Australis, no longer incognita as this map demonstrates, but the southern continent discovered. It lies precisely in the richest climates of the world, and therefore whoever perfectly discovers and settles it will become infallibly possessed of territories as rich, as fruitful, and as capable of improvement as any that have hitherto been found out either in the East Indies or the West." John Harris's Navigantium ac Itinerantium Bibliotheca, or Voyages and Travels, 1744 to 1748, 1764, recommended exploration of the east coast of New Holland, with a view to a British colonization by way of Abel Tasman's route to Van Diemen's Land. John Callender put forward a proposal in 1766 for Britain to found a colony of banished convicts in the South Sea or in Terra Australis to enable the mother country to exploit the riches of those regions. He said, "This world must present us with many things entirely new, as hitherto we have had little more knowledge of it than if it had lain in another planet. Sweden's King Gustav III had ambitions to establish a colony for his country at the Swan River in 1786, but the plan was stillborn. 16 years after Cook's landfall on the east coast of Australia, the British government decided to establish a colony at Botany Bay. The American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, saw Britain lose most of its North American colonies and consider establishing replacement territories. Britain had transported about 50,000 convicts to the New World from 1718 to 1775 and was now searching for an alternative. The temporary solution of floating prison hulks had reached capacity and was a public health hazard, while the option of building more jails and workhouses was deemed too expensive. In 1779, Sir Joseph Banks, the eminent scientist who had accompanied James Cook on his 1770 voyage, recommended Botany Bay as a suitable site for a penal settlement. Banks's plan was to send 200 to 300 convicts to Botany Bay, where they could be left to their own devices and not be a burden on the British taxpayer. Under Banks's guidance, the American loyalist James Matra, who had also traveled with Cook, produced a new plan for colonizing New South Wales in 1783. Matra argued that the country was suitable for plantations of sugar, cotton, and tobacco. New Zealand timber and hemp or flax could prove valuable commodities. It could form a base for Pacific trade, and it could be a suitable compensation for displaced American loyalists. Following an interview with Secretary of State Lord Sydney in 1784, Matra amended his proposal to include convicts as settlers, considering that this would benefit both economy to the public and humanity to the individual. The London newspapers announced in November 1784 that a plan has been presented to the Prime Minister and is now before the Cabinet for instituting a new colony in New Holland. In this vast tract of land, every sort of produce and improvement of which the various soils of the earth are capable may be expected. The major alternative to Botany Bay was sending convicts to Africa. From 1775, convicts had been sent to garrison British forts in West Africa, but the experiment had proved unsuccessful. In 1783, the Pitt government considered exiling convicts to a small river island in Gambia where they could form a self-governing community, a colony of thieves, at no expense to the government. In 1785, a parliamentary select committee chaired by Lord Beauchamp recommended against the Gambia plan, but failed to endorse the alternative of Botany Bay. In a second report, Beauchamp recommended a penal settlement at Das Voltas Bay in modern Namibia. The plan was dropped, however, when an investigation of the site in 1786 found it to be unsuitable. 2 weeks later, in August 1786, the Pitt government announced its intention to send convicts to Botany Bay. The government incorporated the settlement of Norfolk Island into their plan, with its attractions of timber and flax, proposed by Banks's Royal Society colleagues, Sir John Call and Sir George Young. There has been a long-standing debate over whether the key consideration in the decision to establish a penal colony at Botany Bay was the pressing need to find a solution to the penal management problem, or whether broader imperial goals, such as trade, securing new supplies of timber and flax for the Navy, and the desirability of strategic ports in the region, were paramount. Leading historians in the debate have included Sir Ernest Scott, Geoffrey Blainey, and Alan Frost. The decision to settle was taken when it seemed the outbreak of civil war in the Netherlands might precipitate a war in which Britain would be again confronted with the alliance of the three naval powers, France, Holland, and Spain, which had brought her to defeat in 1783. Under these circumstances, a naval base in New South Wales, which could facilitate attacks on Dutch and Spanish interests in the region, would be attractive. Specific plans for using the colony as a strategic base against Spanish interests were occasionally made after 1788 but never implemented. McIntyre argues that the evidence for a military strategic motive in establishing the colony is largely circumstantial and hard to reconcile with the strict ban on establishing a shipyard in the colony. Karskens points out that the instructions provided to the first 5 governors of New South Wales showed that the initial plans for the colony were limited. The settlement was to be a self-sufficient penal colony based on subsistence agriculture. Trade, shipping, and shipbuilding were banned in order to keep the convicts isolated and so as not to interfere with the trade monopoly of the British East India Company. There was no plan for economic development apart from investigating the possibility of producing raw materials for Britain. Christopher and Maxwell Stewart argue that whatever the government's original motives were in establishing the colony, by the 1790s it had at least achieved the imperial objective of providing a harbor where vessels could be careened and resupplied. The colony of New South Wales. Establishment of the colony, 1788 to 1792. The territory of New South Wales claimed by Britain included all of Australia eastward of the meridian of 135 degrees east. This included more than half of mainland Australia and reflected the line of division between the claims of Spain and Portugal established in the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Wakentench subsequently commented in a narrative of the expedition to Botany Bay, by this partition it may be fairly presumed that every source of future litigation between the Dutch and us will be forever cut off, as the discoveries of English navigators only are comparised in this territory. The claim also included all the islands adjacent in the Pacific between the latitudes of Cape York and the southern tip of Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. King argues that an unofficial British map published in 1786, a general chart of New Holland, showed the possible extent of this claim. In 1817, the British government withdrew the extensive territorial claim over the South Pacific, passing an act specifying that Tahiti, New Zealand and other islands of the South Pacific were not within His Majesty's dominions. However, it is unclear whether the claim ever extended to the current islands of New Zealand. The colony of New South Wales was established with the arrival of the first fleet of 11 vessels under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip in January 1788. It consisted of more than 1,000 settlers, including 778 convicts, 192 women and 586 men. A few days after arrival at Botany Bay, the fleet moved to the more suitable Port Jackson, where a settlement was established at Sydney Cove on January 26, 1788. This date later became Australia's National Day, Australia Day. The colony was formally proclaimed by Governor Phillip on February 7, 1788 at Sydney. Sydney Cove offered a fresh water supply and a safe harbor, which Phillip described as being, without exception, the finest harbor in the world. Here 1,000 sail of the line may ride in the most perfect security. Governor Phillip was vested with complete authority over the inhabitants of the colony. His personal intent was to establish harmonious relations with local Aboriginal people and try to reform as well as discipline the convicts of the colony. Phillip and several of his officers, most notably Wakentench, left behind journals and accounts of which tell of immense hardships during the first years of settlement. Often Phillip's officers despaired for the future of New South Wales. Early efforts at agriculture were fraught and supplies from overseas were scarce. Between 1788 and 1792, about 3,546 male and 766 female convicts were landed at Sydney. Many new arrivals were sick or unfit for work, and the conditions of healthy convicts only deteriorated with hard labor and poor sustenance in the settlement. The food situation reached crisis point in 1790, and the Second Fleet, which finally arrived in June 1790, had lost a quarter of its passengers through sickness, while the condition of the convicts of the Third Fleet appalled Phillip. However, from 1791, the more regular arrival of ships and the beginnings of trade lessened the feeling of isolation and improved supplies. In 1788, Phillip established a subsidiary settlement on Norfolk Island in the South Pacific, where he hoped to obtain timber and flax for the Navy. The island, however, had no safe harbor, which led the settlement to be abandoned and the settlers evacuated to Tasmania in 1807. The island was subsequently re-established as a site for secondary transportation in 1825. Phillip sent exploratory missions in search of better soils, fixed on the Parramatta region as a promising area for expansion, and moved many of the convicts from late 1788 to establish a small township, which became the main center of the colony's economic life. This left Sydney Cove only as an important port and focus of social life. Poor equipment and unfamiliar soils and climate continued to hamper the expansion of farming from Farm Cove to Parramatta and Tungabi, but a building program, assisted by convict labor, advanced steadily. Between 1788 and 1792, convicts and their jailers made up the majority of the population. However, a free population soon began to grow, consisting of emancipated convicts, locally born children, soldiers whose military service had expired, and finally, free settlers from Britain. Governor Phillip departed the colony for England on December 11, 1792, with the new settlement having survived near starvation and immense isolation for 4 years. A number of foreign commentators pointed to the strategic importance of the new colony. Spanish naval commander Alessandro Malaspina, who visited Sydney in April 1793, reported to his government that the transportation of the convicts constituted the means and not the object of the enterprise. The extension of dominion, mercantile speculations, and the discovery of mines were the real object. Frenchman François Péron of the Baudin expedition visited Sydney in 1802 and reported to the French government, "How can it be conceived that such a monstrous invasion was accomplished, with no complaint in Europe to protest against it? How can it be conceived that Spain, who had previously raised so many objections opposing the occupation of the Malouines, Falkland Islands, meekly allowed a formidable empire to arise to facing her richest possessions? An empire which must either invade or liberate them." King points out that supporters of the penal colony frequently compared the venture to the foundation of Rome, and that the first Great Seal of New South Wales alluded to this. Philip, however, wrote, "I would not wish convicts to lay the foundations of an empire." Consolidation, 1793 to 1821. After the departure of Philip, the colony's military officers began acquiring land and importing consumer goods obtained from visiting ships. Former convicts also farmed land granted to them and engaged in trade. Farms spread to the more fertile lands surrounding Parramatta, Windsor, and Camden, and by 1803 the colony was self-sufficient in grain. Boat building developed in order to make travel easier and exploit the marine resources of the coastal settlements. Sealing and whaling became important industries. The New South Wales Corps was formed in England in 1789 as a permanent regiment of the British Army to relieve the Marines who had accompanied the First Fleet. Officers of the Corps soon became involved in the corrupt and lucrative rum trade in the colony. Governor William Bligh, 1806-1808, tried to suppress the rum trade and the illegal use of Crown land, resulting in the Rum Rebellion of 1808. The Corps, working closely with the newly established wool trader John MacArthur, staged the only successful armed takeover of government in Australian history, deposing Bligh and instigating a brief period of military rule prior to the arrival from Britain of Governor Lachlan Macquarie in 1810. Macquarie served as the last autocratic governor of New South Wales from 1810 to 1821, and had a leading role in the social and economic development of New South Wales, which saw it transition from a penal colony to a budding civil society. He established a bank, a currency, and a hospital. He employed a planner to design the street layout of Sydney and commissioned the construction of roads, wharves, churches, and public buildings. He sent explorers out from Sydney, and in 1815, a road across the Blue Mountains was completed, opening the way for large-scale farming and grazing in the lightly wooded pastures west of the Great Dividing Range. Central to Macquarie's policy was his treatment of the emancipists, whom he considered should be treated as social equals to free settlers in the colony. He appointed emancipists to key government positions, including Francis Greenway as colonial architect and William Redfern as a magistrate. His policy on emancipists was opposed by many influential free settlers, officers, and officials, and London became concerned at the cost of his public works. In 1819, London appointed J.T. Biggie to conduct an inquiry into the colony, and Macquarie resigned shortly before the report of the inquiry was published. Expansion, 1821 to 1850. In 1820, British settlement was largely confined to a 100-kilometer radius around Sydney and to the central plain of Van Diemen's Land. The settler population was 26,000 on the mainland and 6,000 in Van Diemen's Land. Following the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the transportation of convicts increased rapidly and the number of free settlers grew steadily. From 1821 to 1840, 55,000 convicts arrived in New South Wales and 60,000 in Van Diemen's Land. However, by 1830, free settlers and the locally born exceeded the convict population of New South Wales. From the 1820s, squatters increasingly established unauthorized cattle and sheep runs beyond the official limits of the settled colony. In 1836, a system of annual licenses authorizing grazing on Crown land was introduced in an attempt to control the pastoral industry, but booming wool prices and the high cost of land in the settled areas encouraged further squatting. By 1844, wool accounted for half of the colony's exports, and by 1850 most of the eastern third of New South Wales was controlled by fewer than 2,000 pastoralists. In 1825, the western boundary of New South Wales was extended to longitude 129 degrees east, which is the current boundary of Western Australia. As a result, the territory of New South Wales reached its greatest extent, covering the area of the modern state as well as modern Queensland, Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia, and the Northern Territory. By 1850, the settler population of New South Wales had grown to 180,000, not including the 70 to 75,000 living in the area, which became the separate colony of Victoria in 1851. Establishment of further colonies. After hosting Nicolas Baudin's French naval expedition in Sydney in 1802, Governor Philip Gidley King decided to establish a settlement in Van Diemen's Land, modern Tasmania, in 1803, partly to forestall a possible French settlement. The British settlement of the island soon centered on Launceston in the north and Hobart in the south. For the first 2 decades, the settlement relied heavily on convict labor, small-scale farming, and sheep grazing, sealing, whaling, and the dog and kangaroo economy, where emancipists and escaped convicts hunted native game with guns and dogs. From the 1820s, free settlers were encouraged by the offer of land grants in proportion to the capital the settlers would bring. Almost 2 million acres of land was granted to free settlers in the decade, and the number of sheep in the island increased from 170,000 to 1 million. The land grants created a social division between large landowners and a majority of landless convicts and emancipists. Van Diemen's Land became a separate colony from New South Wales in December 1825 and continued to expand through the 1830s, supported by farming, sheep grazing, and whaling. Following the suspension of convict transportation to New South Wales in 1840, Van Diemen's Land became the main destination for convicts. Transportation to Van Diemen's Land ended in 1853, and in 1856 the colony officially changed its name to Tasmania. Victoria. Pastoralists from Van Diemen's Land began squatting in the Port Phillip hinterland on the mainland in 1834, attracted by its rich grasslands. In 1835, John Batman and others negotiated the transfer of 100,000 acres of land from the Kulin people. However, the treaty was annulled the same year when the British Colonial Office issued the proclamation of Governor Burke stating that all unalienated land in the colony was vacant Crown land, irrespective of whether it was occupied by traditional landowners. Its publication meant that from then, all people found occupying land without the authority of the government would be considered illegal trespassers. In 1836, Port Phillip was officially recognized as a district of New South Wales and opened for settlement. The main settlement of Melbourne was established in 1837 as a planned town on the instructions of Governor Burke. Squatters and settlers from Van Diemen's Land and New South Wales soon arrived in large numbers, and by 1850 the district had a population of 75,000 Europeans, 2,000 Indigenous inhabitants, and 5 million sheep. In 1851, the Port Phillip district separated from New South Wales as the colony of Victoria. Western Australia. In 1826, the governor of New South Wales, Ralph Darling, sent a military garrison to King George Sound, the basis of the later town of Albany, to deter the French from establishing a settlement in Western Australia. In 1827, the head of the expedition, Major Edmund Lockyer, formally annexed the western third of the continent as a British colony. In 1829, the Swan River Colony was established at the sites of modern Fremantle and Perth, becoming the first convict-free and privatised colony in Australia. However, much of the arable land was allocated to absentee owners, and the development of the colony was hampered by poor soil, the dry climate, and a lack of capital and labour. By 1850, there were a little more than 5,000 settlers, half of them children. The colony accepted convicts from that year because of the acute shortage of labor. South Australia. The province of South Australia was established in 1836 as a privately financed settlement based on the theory of systematic colonization developed by Edward Gibbon Wakefield. The intention was to found a free colony based on private investment at little cost to the British government. Power was divided between the Crown and a board of commissioners of colonization responsible to about 300 shareholders. Settlement was to be controlled to promote a balance between land, capital, and labor. Convict labor was banned in the hope of making the colony more attractive to respectable families and promote an even balance between male and female settlers. The city of Adelaide was to be planned with a generous provision of churches, parks, and schools. Land was to be sold at a uniform price and the proceeds used to secure an adequate supply of labor through selective assisted migration. Various religious, personal, and commercial freedoms were guaranteed, and the letters patent enabling the South Australia Act 1834 included a guarantee of the rights of any Aboriginal natives and their descendants to lands they now actually occupied or enjoyed. The colony was badly hit by the Depression of 1841-44, and overproduction of wheat and overinvestment in infrastructure almost bankrupted it. Conflict with Indigenous traditional landowners also reduced the protections they had been promised. In 1842, the settlement became a Crown colony administered by the governor and an appointed legislative council. The economy recovered from 1845, supported by wheat farming, sheep grazing, and a boom in copper mining. By 1850, the settler population had grown to 60,000, and the following year the colony achieved limited self-government with a partially elected legislative council. Queensland. In 1824, the Moreton Bay penal settlement was established on the site of present-day Brisbane as a place of secondary punishment. In 1842, the penal colony was closed and the area was opened for free settlement. By 1850, the population of Brisbane had reached 8,000 and increasing numbers of pastoralists were grazing cattle and sheep in the Darling Downs west of the town. However, several attempts to establish settlements north of the Tropic of Capricorn had failed, and the settler population in the north remained small. Frontier violence between settlers and the Indigenous population became severe as pastoralism expanded north of the Tweed River. A series of disputes between northern pastoralists and the government in Sydney led to increasing demands from the northern settlers for separation from New South Wales. In 1857, the British government agreed to the separation, and in 1859 the colony of Queensland was proclaimed. The settler population of the new colony was 25,000, and the vast majority of its territory was still occupied by its traditional owners. Convicts and colonial society. Convicts and emancipists. Between 1788 and 1868, approximately 161,700 convicts, of whom 25,000 were women, were transported to the Australian colonies of New South Wales, Van Diemen's Land and Western Australia. Historian Lloyd Robson has estimated that perhaps two-thirds were thieves from working-class towns, particularly from the Midlands and north of England. The majority were repeat offenders. The literacy rate of convicts was above average, and they brought a range of useful skills to the new colony, including building, farming, sailing, fishing, and hunting. The small number of free settlers meant that early governors also had to rely on convicts and emancipists for professions such as lawyers, architects, surveyors, and teachers. The first governors saw New South Wales as a place of punishment and reform of convicts. Convicts worked on government farms and public works such as land clearing and building. After 1792, the majority were assigned to work for private employers, including emancipists, as transported convicts who had completed their sentence or had been pardoned called themselves. Emancipists were granted small plots of land for farming and a year of government rations. Later, they were assigned convict labor to help them work their farms. Some convicts were assigned to military officers to run their businesses because the officers did not want to be directly associated with trade. These convicts learned commercial skills which could help them work for themselves when their sentence ended, or they were granted a ticket of leave, a form of parole. Convicts soon established a system of piecework which allowed them to work for wages once their allocated tasks were completed. Due to the shortage of labor, wage rates before 1815 were high for male workers, although much lower for females engaged in domestic work. In 1814, Governor Macquarie ordered that convicts had to work until 3 p.m., after which private employers had to pay them wages for any additional work. By 1821, convicts, emancipists, and their children owned 2/3 of the land under cultivation, half the cattle, and 1/3 of the sheep. They also worked in trades and small business. Emancipists employed about half of the convicts assigned to private masters. After 1815, wages and employment opportunities for convicts and emancipists deteriorated as a sharp increase in the number of convicts transported led to an oversupply of labor. A series of reforms recommended by J.T. Biggie in 1822 and 1823 also sought to change the nature of the colony and make transportation an object of real terror. The food ration for convicts was cut and their opportunities to work for wages restricted. More convicts were assigned to rural work gangs, bureaucratic control and surveillance of convicts was made more systematic. Isolated penal settlements were established as places of secondary punishment. The rules for tickets of leave were tightened, and land grants were skewed to favor free settlers with large capital. As a result, convicts who arrived after 1820 were far less likely to become property owners, to marry, and to establish families. Free settlers. The Biggie reforms also aimed to encourage affluent free settlers by offering them land grants for farming and grazing in proportion to their capital. From 1831, the colonies replaced land grants with land sales by auction at a fixed minimum price per acre, the proceeds being used to fund the assisted migration of workers. From 1821 to 1850, Australia attracted 200,000 immigrants from the United Kingdom. Although most immigrants settled in towns, many were attracted to the high wages and business opportunities available in rural areas. However, the system of land grants and later land sales led to the concentration of land in the hands of a small number of affluent settlers. 2/3 of the migrants to Australia during this period received assistance from the British or colonial governments. Healthy young workers without dependents were favored for assisted migration, especially those with experience as agricultural laborers or domestic workers. Families of convicts were also offered free passage, and about 3,500 migrants were selected under the English Poor Laws. Various special purpose and charitable schemes, such as those of Caroline Chisholm and John Dunmore Lang, also provided migration assistance. Women. Colonial Australia was characterized by an imbalance of the sexes, as women comprised only about 15% of convicts transported. The first female convicts brought a range of skills, including experience as domestic workers, dairy women, and farm workers. Due to the shortage of women in the colony, they were more likely to marry than men and tended to choose older, skilled men with property as husbands. The early colonial courts enforced the property rights of women independently of their husbands, and the ration system also gave women and their children some protection from abandonment. Women were active in business and agriculture from the early years of the colony, among the most successful being the former convict-turned-entrepreneur Mary Raby and the agriculturalist Elizabeth MacArthur. 1/3 of the shareholders of the first colonial bank, founded in 1817, were women. One of the goals of the assisted migration programs from the 1830s was to promote migration of women and families to provide a more even gender balance in the colonies. The philanthropist Caroline Chisholm established a shelter and labor exchange for migrant women in New South Wales in the 1840s and promoted the settlement of single and married women in rural areas, where she hoped they would have a civilizing influence on rough colonial manners and act as God's police. Between 1830 and 1850, the female proportion of the Australian settler population increased from 24% to 41%. Religion. The early chaplains of the colony were also civil magistrates with the power to discipline convicts and grant tickets of leave. The Church of England was the only recognized church before 1820, and its clergy worked closely with the governors. Richard Johnson, chief chaplain 1788 to 1802, was charged by Governor Arthur Phillip with improving public morality in the colony and was also heavily involved in health and education. Samuel Marsden, various ministries 1795 to 1838, became known for his missionary work, the severity of his punishments as a magistrate. and the vehemence of his public denunciations of Catholicism and Irish convicts. About a quarter of convicts were Catholics, and they frequently requested a Catholic priest to perform their rites. The lack of official recognition of Catholicism was combined with suspicion of Irish convicts, which only increased after the Irish-led Castle Hill Rebellion of 1804. Only 2 Catholic priests operated temporarily in the colony before Governor Macquarie appointed official Catholic chaplains in New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land in 1820. The Biggie reports recommended that the status of the Anglican Church be enhanced as source of stability and moral authority in the colony. An Anglican archdeacon was appointed in 1824 and allocated a seat in the First Advisory Legislative Council. The Anglican clergy and schools also received state support. This policy was changed under Governor Burke by the Church Acts of 1836 and 1837. The government now provided state support for the clergy and church buildings of the 4 largest denominations: Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian, and, later, Methodist. The Church Acts did not alleviate sectarianism, as many Anglicans saw state support of the Catholic Church as a threat. The prominent Presbyterian minister John Dunmore Lang also promoted sectarian divisions in the 1840s. State support, however, led to a growth in church activities. Charitable associations such as the Catholic Sisters of Charity, founded in 1838, provided hospitals, orphanages, and asylums for the old and disabled. Religious organizations were also the main providers of school education in the first half of the 19th century, a notable example being Lang's Australian College, which opened in 1831. Many religious associations, such as the Sisters of St. Joseph, co-founded by Mary MacKillop in 1866, continued their educational activities after the provision of secular state schools grew from the 1850s. Exploration of the continent. In 1798–99, George Bass and Matthew Flinders set out from Sydney in a sloop and circumnavigated Tasmania, thus proving it to be an island. In 1801–02, Matthew Flinders in HMS Investigator led the first circumnavigation of Australia. Aboard ship was the Aboriginal explorer Bungaree of the Sydney district, who became the first person born on the Australian continent to circumnavigate the Australian continent. In 1798, the former convict John Wilson and 2 companions crossed the Blue Mountains west of Sydney in an expedition ordered by Governor Hunter. Hunter suppressed news of the feat for fear that it would encourage convicts to abscond from the settlement. In 1813, Gregory Blaxland, William Lawson, and William Wentworth crossed the mountains by a different route, and a road was soon built to the central tablelands. In 1824, the Governor Sir Thomas Brisbane commissioned Hamilton Hume and former Royal Navy Captain William Havell to lead an expedition to find new grazing land in the south of the colony, and also to find an answer to the mystery of where New South Wales' western rivers flowed. Over 16 weeks in 1824–25, Hume and Havell journeyed to Port Phillip and back. They made many important discoveries, including the Murray River, which they named the Hume, many of its tributaries, and good agricultural and grazing lands between Gunning, New South Wales, and Corio Bay, Port Phillip. Charles Sturt led an expedition along the Macquarie River in 1828 and discovered the Darling River. A theory had developed that the inland rivers of New South Wales were draining into an inland sea. Leading a second expedition in 1829, Sturt followed the Murrumbidgee River into a broad and noble river, which he named the Murray River. His party then followed this river to its junction with the Darling River. Sturt continued downriver onto Lake Alexandrina, where the Murray meets the sea in South Australia. Surveyor General Sir Thomas Mitchell conducted a series of expeditions from the 1830s to fill in the gaps left by these previous expeditions. Mitchell employed 3 Aboriginal guides and was meticulous in recording the Aboriginal place names around the colony. He also recorded a violent encounter with traditional owners on the Murray in 1836, in which his men pursued them, shooting as many as they could. The Polish scientist and explorer Count Paul Edmund Sturzelecki conducted surveying work in the Australian Alps in 1839 and, led by his 2 Aboriginal guides Charlie Terra and Jackie, became the first European to ascend Australia's highest peak, which he named Mount Kosciuszko in honor of the Polish patriot Tadeusz Kosciuszko. European explorers penetrated deeper into the interior in the 1840s in a quest to discover new lands for agriculture or answer scientific inquiries. The German scientist Ludwig Leichhardt led 3 expeditions in northern Australia in this decade, sometimes with the help of Aboriginal guides, identifying the grazing potential of the region and making important discoveries in the fields of botany and geology. He and his party disappeared in 1848 while attempting to cross the continent from east to west. Edmund Kennedy led an expedition into what is now far western Queensland in 1847 before being speared by Aborigines in the Cape York Peninsula in 1848. In 1860, Burke and Wills led the first south-north crossing of the continent from Melbourne to the Gulf of Carpentaria. Lacking bushcraft and unwilling to learn from the local Aboriginal people, Burke and Wills died in 1861. Having returned from the Gulf to their rendezvous point at Cooper's Creek only to discover the rest of their party had departed the location only a matter of hours previously. They became tragic heroes to the European settlers, their funeral attracting a crowd of more than 50,000 and their story inspiring numerous books, artworks, films, and representations in popular culture. In 1862, John McDouall Stewart succeeded in traversing central Australia from south to north. His expedition mapped out the route, which was later followed by the Australian Overland Telegraph Line. The completion of the Overland Telegraph Line in 1872 was associated with further exploration of the Gibson Desert and the Nullarbor Plain. While exploring central Australia in 1872, Ernest Giles sighted Kata Tjuta from a location near Kings Canyon and called it Mount Olga. The following year, William Goss observed Uluru and named it Ayers Rock in honor of the Chief Secretary of South Australia, Sir Henry Ayres. In 1879, Alexander Forrest trekked from the north coast of Western Australia to the Overland Telegraph, discovering land suitable for grazing in the Kimberley region. Impact of British settlement on Indigenous population. When the first fleet arrived in Sydney Cove with some 1,300 colonists in January 1788, the Aboriginal population of the Sydney region is estimated to have been about 3,000 people. The first governor of New South Wales, Arthur Phillip, arrived with instructions to endeavour by every possible means to open an intercourse with the natives and to conciliate their affections, enjoining all our subjects to live in amity and kindness with them. Disease. The relative isolation of the indigenous population for some 60,000 years meant that they had little resistance to many introduced diseases. An outbreak of smallpox in April 1789 killed about half the Aboriginal population of the Sydney region, while only 1 death was recorded among the settlers. The source of the outbreak is controversial. Some researchers contend that it originated from contact with Indonesian fishermen in the far north and spread along Aboriginal trade routes, while others argue that it is more likely to have been inadvertently or deliberately spread by settlers. There were further smallpox outbreaks devastating Aboriginal populations from the late 1820s, affecting southeastern Australia in the early 1860s. Traveling inland from the Coburg Peninsula in the north to the Great Australian Bight in the south, and in the late 1860s from the Kimberley to Geraldton. According to Josephine Flood, the estimated Aboriginal mortality rate from smallpox was 60% on first exposure, 50% in the tropics, and 25% in the arid interior. Other introduced diseases such as measles, influenza, typhoid, and tuberculosis also resulted in high death rates in Aboriginal communities. Butlin estimates that the Aboriginal population in the area of modern Victoria was around 50,000 in 1788 before 2 smallpox outbreaks reduced it to about 12,500 in 1830. Between 1835, the settlement of Port Phillip, and 1853, the Aboriginal population of Victoria fell from 10,000 to around 2,000. It is estimated that about 60% of these deaths were from introduced diseases, 18% from natural causes, and 15% from settler violence. Venereal diseases were also a factor in Indigenous depopulation, reducing Aboriginal fertility rates in southeastern Australia by an estimated 40% by 1855. By 1890, up to 50% of the Aboriginal population in some regions of Queensland were affected.